This lecture focuses on the IMF in order to better explain what it does, how it works, and why it has been controversial over the last few decades. Since the IMF is a pretty major component of the world economy and an institution of ongoing relevance, I think it's important to better understand this institution and the policies it has developed down the years. To begin with, though, and to better understand this, let's start with a little bit of background. Let's start by discussing the situation of government debt and public economies in general. This might provide a little bit of useful background for those of you who haven't studied this topic a whole lot. Let's say you are a country, and let's say you have a lot of debt. On top of that, your economy is stagnating. You're simply not growing economically very quickly, and it's becoming harder and harder to make the payments on that debt. Well, what do you do? Classically, you have two choices. On the one hand, you can use those Keynesian policies that we talked about a little bit earlier in the class. Measures like countercyclical spending, progressive taxation, and keeping interest rates low to encourage people to borrow and invest. Of course, the consequence of doing this might be that that debt takes a little while to pay back. It might not happen very quickly. But it's one way of trying to ensure that you can service your debt slowly, while also maintaining a certain level of social and political stability in your country. On the other hand, you have what are known as the austerity policies. Measures like cutting public spending, taxing to maximize debt repayment, regardless of whether that tax burden falls on the richest or the poorest or the middle classes in your country. And driving interest rates up, which will make your currency more valuable, but will also make life a lot more miserable for small businesses, households, students with debt, and so on and so forth. Well, of course, in reality, most countries are never entirely on one side of the column or the other side. They usually adopt a mix of both policies. But from the 1970s onwards, the rich countries in the world are going to start putting a lot more emphasis on the right side of the column, on the austerity policies. They are going to be helped in this by the IMF and by the World Bank. And the consequences, while occasionally good, are also in lots of cases going to be very troubling and ultimately pretty detrimental to economic growth and development. From its creation in 1944 until the 1970s, the IMF actually plays a pretty minor role in global economic governance. Under Fordism and Taylorism, crises are few, and the IMF is a lot less glamorous than the World Bank, headquartered more or less across the street from it in Washington, D.C. These three combinations of factors, though, will start to change this. First, in 1973, oil prices will shoot up 150%. Then subsequently, they will shoot up more, making it very hard for poor countries to import what they need. All of a sudden, petroleum-based imports, which basically means virtually everything, become radically more expensive. 2. This will create a dilemma for poor countries. If you print more money to pay your overseas bills, you are going to generate inflation inside your country. That in turn is going to make imports even more expensive, because when you inflate a currency, its value goes down. On the other hand, if you simply do nothing, that's not a whole lot better either. 3. This is all much harder in the aftermath of those free-flowing currencies that we talked about, free-floating currencies that we talked about earlier, which destabilize many poor countries' balance sheets. The gold standard that we discussed previously certainly had plenty of problems. One of the advantages it did have, though, was to allow a little bit of longer-term economic planning, because you knew what the value of currencies would be going forward. After 1973, especially for smaller countries, that gets a lot harder. These combinations of factors are going to mean that smaller, poorer countries, many of them newly decolonized, let's not forget, are going to have to come up with huge sums of money very quickly. They are going to wind up acquiring large amounts of debt. They are going to be unable to service that debt. The private banking sector won't want to deal with them anymore. And, lacking any other solution, they go to the IMF. Well, the IMF is governed through a complex structure that pretty explicitly privileges the interests of its biggest contributors. Countries acquire SDRs, or special drawing rights, which can then be converted into a vote share on the IMF Board of Governors. In practice, though, what this means is that the biggest contributors have the biggest vote share. Italy has a larger vote share on the IMF than does India. Switzerland outweighs many countries much larger than it, and so on and so forth. Needless to say, when the IMF is defined as a rich country club, this tends to influence the decisions they make, and this tends to influence the kinds of policies that they want to adopt. Well, in practical terms, a poor country, when dealing with the IMF, will also deal with the World Bank and a regional development bank, say the African Development Bank in Africa or the Inter-American Development Bank in the Americas. The idea is to create a comprehensive loan package that can, at least in principle, return the country to economic health. The folks at the IMF, though, are not stupid, and they know full well that they risk not getting repaid if they just hand out money blindly. So, they impose conditions on the countries receiving aid, usually so that the recipient undertakes economic reforms agreed to or desired by the fund. They also hand out money in tranches, or slices, over time. You don't get all the money at once, you get it progressively in chunks. This gives them leverage. If you want the money badly enough, you pretty much have to agree to the terms and to the conditions that the IMF sets out. Now, conditionality is discussed in your readings and in your textbook. It can have useful effects. For example, it can keep a country from piling up odious debt, which is a term for debt misappropriated by, say, a dictatorship, and that doesn't go towards development at all, but that might go towards building presidential palaces, enriching the president's circle of friends, and so forth. Ecuador, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Haiti all suffered for years under piles of such debts, meaning that much of the wealth generated inside the country, such as it was, went to the fund and to investors in the rich world. These countries are paying off large amounts of accumulated odious debt, meaning that much of the wealth they're generating inside the country is really not staying inside the country, it's going out. Well, conditionality, intelligently applied and properly applied, can indeed help avoid incurring odious debt. This said, many of the conditions imposed by the IMF are, well, less than obviously beneficial for poor countries. Very often, the policies set by the fund reflect rich countries' ideas of what an economy ought to look like and how it ought to function. So, for example, many of the measures the fund insists on are austerity measures. Things like cutting public spending, cutting wages, welfare, education, in order to help the country get out of debt. These mostly affect the poor, and of course, since it's the national governments themselves who administer the measures, they tend to usually target poorer people because poorer people don't have as much influence as richer people do. Likewise, all kinds of other things can have perverse consequences. Reducing public debt can be a good thing. Of course, if you do it too quickly or you do it imprudently, it can also destabilize the government tremendously. Opening markets to foreign goods, likewise, can be great, or it can throw a lot of people out of work very quickly. Sometimes making or encouraging political changes can be part of an IMF package. All of these things and all of these terms fall under the doctrine of conditionality. While conditionality was always part of the IMF, it's really from the 1980s until 2005 that we see the fund taking a very aggressive role in imposing conditions on borrower countries. This is often referred to as the so-called Washington Consensus, named because the IMF and the World Bank are headquartered in Washington, D.C. And it tends to focus on measures like cutting public spending, reducing inflation, expanding free trade, encouraging foreign investment, and encouraging business flexibility and deregulation. This is a useful 5-point schema for what the Washington Consensus means and what it is. Now, you'll notice something about these policies. They are all pretty much the opposites of Keynesian economics. They are all pretty much a radical reversal of the older Keynesian consensus. And they are also quite controversial. At times, the conditions make matters worse and not better. Austerity usually falls hardest on the poor. We saw this in 1998 in Indonesia, when people rioted in the face of quickly rising food costs. People also protest when the cost of vital services shoots up, such as when residents of Cochabamba, Bolivia, had their water bills go up 30% in 1 year after a private company took control of the city's water system on the advice of the IMF and the World Bank, and wanted to make money really, really quickly. The effect of this is to leave poor countries in some ways in more debt than they were in before, and certainly hardly in a good position for economic growth and stability and prosperity. Well, I'm making the IMF sound a little bit like the bad guy in the story of economic development, and of course there's a certain amount of truth to this story. It's also a little bit more nuanced than that too. Since 2005, at the G8 meeting in Gleneagles, Scotland, on a magnificent golf course, the G8, the group of the 8 largest economies in the world, agreed to a package to basically reduce the debt burden on poorer countries and start reforming the way the IMF does business. This included 100% debt cancellation for the very poorest countries that are not run by dictatorships. In other words, that are run by democratic or at least reasonably democratic regimes. It included a big surge in aid to those same countries. And it included a new, more Keynesian economic policy approach from the IMF. To make a long story short, after 2005, the IMF stops being quite so focused on austerity policies and a lot more focused on stimulating growth and demand, even if that means that debts take a little bit longer to pay off. Do these new measures help? Yes, they do, and in the sense they already have. There are parts of these measures that we are much closer to fulfilling now than they were in 2000. For example, we've done a fair amount of work on eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. The number of people living on $1 or $1.25 US per day is today much lower than it was in 2000. On the other hand, many other issues that you see on this chart, especially promoting gender equality and the empowerment of women in the form of equal access to education, are still a long way from being fulfilled, and indeed a lot of work still needs to be done.